Welcome back to yet another video on Java interview series. These are the real interview question which was asked in Synechron. The candidate had the experience between 2 to 8 years, and this was the first round. Currently, after all the rounds has happened, he has 16 lakh LPA offer, and in this we are going to discuss about core Java, Spring Boot, and Microservice interview questions along with SQL. This video will be helpful for those who are going to prepare or going to attend Synechron interview or any in general interview is prepared for they are preparing. This will be quite helpful. So make sure you watch till the end because I have explained each and every questions along with the answers. So let's begin. Now, these two questions I would say in general are asked like tell me about yourself and what is your project architecture and project team structure. How do you work? I mean, what's your how do you take the requirement? How you do you work? These all questions have been asked and actually you need to answer in a pretty confident way. So make sure you get prepared with these two questions about like what is it. I mean, tell me about yourself and then explain the project architecture. So be prepared. Overall, you have to understand your the application structure, what is being used in out. So you should be knowing in and out of your project because that is what they are expecting if they are asking this question, right? Now, when in terms of jumping into the Java, right? So interview will definitely ask questions around Java, then collections, then Spring Boot, and then microservice, and then SQL, right? So you have to be prepared in that. So these questions are around that as well. So Java basics are important, and also you need to understand deep understanding when your experience is growing, right? So have that particular preparation. So this video will help you with that. Now, the very first question is like, what is the difference between this and the super keyword? Okay. Now, this keyword basically is used in the context of the current instances, and if you want to refer the parent classes, right? So let's talk about keyword that is this, right? So when we refer to an current object of an class, right, then that is this is used, right? So it is used to refer this. Now I mean, we have to differentiate or we have to distinguish between the instance variable and the parameter which is passed in some name, right? So as a name or a method, right? So we used to call that using that particular in this name, right? So that is what how we differentiate. Now, let's say you want to call any other constructor in the same class, right? We used to call using this, right? So this was the way you used to call this, right? So that's how we can call. Now, let's say you want to invoke certain current objects method, okay? So we have to first create a constructor, and then in that particular method, we can refer to that particular using this particular that name, and then the particular referring that particular object, right? So this is how we access this and the use of it. Now, super keyword is used in the context of parent and child class, right? So when we want to call any parent class constructor, or you want to access certain methods of a parent or a fields, right? We use that super keyword, right? Now, if you see an example, we have an animal and then we have a dog which extend that. But if you want to see that the sound method, you will see the super dot sound which is called at the very first. So it's called the super plus method. I hope you got this particular concept and you are very clear on it. Now, what are wrapper classes and why do we use them? Now, these are the object representation of the primitive types. Basically, when you want when your language has and primitive types like int, short, long, right? And you want to deal with certain object because this is an object-oriented language, right? So there was a need that you provide that compatibility. So each primitive type which has a corresponding wrapper type to it. So that is in the lang java.lang package, right? So here are the list of it like byte, short, integer, long, float, double, character, then boolean. Now, why do we use it? As I mentioned, we wanted the object representation. Let's say you want to store some collections like in the array list, right? So only we used to store objects, not primitive types. Now wrapper give a chance to store that particular primitive value in the collection, right? Now we have some utility methods which has got where we will be able to convert from different data types, right? So one is parse int right, in integer value of, right. So this will be helping you the utility methods converting between those. Now autoboxing and unboxing, this is automatic conversion between the primitive to the wrapper classes. So whenever it was required, we used to assign it and then convert that particular int to an integer variable. Similar way for other wrapper classes, right? So that's how we used to work, right? Now nullability. Now primitive types cannot be null. How we can deal with primitive types? So there came a wrapper classes which can be represented as an object and can be denote as an value which is not there, which is null, right? So that's how we do that. So if you see here an example, earlier it was n is equal to 10. Now we have converted into a integer. Now we can actually, if you see here, this is the int value of it, right? So we are unboxing from wrapper to primitive. Now we are doing the unboxing, right? Now, what is the difference between an abstract class and an interface? Now, this is very important question, and I would say this is one of the core basics question which normally any interviewer tries to get an insight from the interviewee that whether he is well aware of the Java as a language, he has tried, he has made his hands dirty in the Java, he has worked, right? So that's the question which will denote that yeah, this interview is prepared and then he has worked on, right? So now abstract class is nothing but you cannot instantiate and they contain certain abstracts method. They will not have any implementation, right? And also it will have certain methods which are concrete, which will have implementation. But when you compare with the interfaces, these are typically a type of similar to the classes, but they are type of references, basically a super thing, but which can only have the abstract. Now, after Java 8, there has been a possibility of default and static method, but earlier, prior to it, there was no provision to have that particular interfaces with the implementation, basically. Now, there was a concept of multiple inheritance, right? So, with using the abstract classes, a class A, let's say, can inherit only those properties, only one abstract method actually, I would say, from the class, right? So this was a single inheritance basically. Now, interfaces, it gave a chance that a class can implement multiple interfaces. So in this case, the diamond problem was solved, that is the multiple inheritance. So with abstract class, you cannot have a multiple inheritance concept. So that's where this inheritance solved it. Now methods, basically in abstract classes you will have both abstract and non-concrete methods which will have the code. But in interfaces, all the methods are implicitly, I would say, abstract. And as I mentioned, after Java there was default and static implementation, but until then, if you see, it is completely abstract. Now, access modifier which are used in abstract classes are like they are different, right? So we can use public, protected, private. But in interface, all the methods which are defined, right? Those are public by default, and they cannot have other access modifier at all, right? So that's what the restriction imposed. Now, when you want to deal with the constructor, now constructor in the abstract class can have a constructor, right? So it can, there is no restriction on it. But in interface, you cannot have a constructor, right? So it's a straightforward rule. Now, fields. Now, when it comes to accessing or having those particular fields, you can have that in the instant abstract variable classes. But in interfaces, you can only have static final variables. Okay, so that those are only constants which are used across the application, right? So that these are the basic differences, and hope you will be able to answer in a clear way what I've explained. Now, this is one of the common basic level question, or sometimes it is asked in the advanced level. But here they wanted to understand what is the basic difference between double equal to and dot equals. Now, if you know, dot equals method is a part of the object class, and by default everything the implementation is it is inherited from all the object class, right? But when it comes to used to comparing certain objects, right, they behave quite different. Now let's take about the equal to, which always compares the reference comparison, right? So it always compares the memory location where these particular two objects are stored, right? Now it checks whether these two particular references are pointing to the same object in the memory or not. But let's say we are dealing with primitive types, then this will compare the actual content, that is the value, right? Because this will be primitive types, not the objects. We are dealing with primitive, hence it is that the case. Now, if you see for the objects, right, the string one and string two, you'll see that there are, if you compare with the double equal to, it will definitely show as a false, because if you see this new string, it will definitely create a new string in a different location, right? That's how it will not be same, right? Because they are pointing to a different memory or reference location. But when it comes to a reference, primitive types, you have two variables which will be having same values, and when you compare it, it will be definitely true because they are comparing the actual values. Okay, that's how it difference between the objects and the primitive types in terms of references, that is equal double equal to. Now, when you compare that with the dot equals, right, it actually compares the content. Okay, so it will compare the content of the two objects, not their references, right? So when you define an object, but it is often sometime overridden in a class or like string, integer, or any uh, other, you compare their content meaningfully, right? So it will definitely will be same, because they are trying to check the content of it, right, not the reference. The very next question is about what is the difference between throws and throws in Java, right? So when you're dealing with exception handling, interview would like to know, after the basic set of questions in Java, you wanted to know about whether you have done the exception handling, how you handle the exception gracefully, right? So he may ask you some related questions related to the exception and how they are handled. So in this, one of the question is like, what is the difference between throw and throws? So when you want to throw certain exception, right? Let's say the throw, we use that particular keyword. Now we want to explicitly throw this exception up. This is because not there is some error in the code or exception in the code, but that basically you wanted to throw explicitly in certain blockage of the code, or let's say in certain method, right? So using we can use this particular throws keyword, right? So it is we have the instances such as we can make use of this particular throwable exception and its subclasses, right? So we can use both a checked and unchecked exception to throw this. So if you see here, if the age is below 18, you throw some illegal argument exception. Now in this example, when throw is like, throws an illegal argument expression, illegal argument exception, if the age is less than 18, right? That's how it will be executed. Now, when we discuss about throws, right, it is used in the just beside the declaration of the method. Okay, I would say. So it is used in the declaration part, and it will throw any exception, or maybe it can throw only single exception, or it can catch throw more than one exception, but it will handle that. So when you're declaring a certain method, you'll decide that throws, you will have the multiple exception with the comma. So if there is a certain exception happening, it will be delegated to the calling method. Okay. And we can have the list of exception which can be separated by the commas, right? But here we only have the checked exception, right? Not the runtime exception which can be thrown. So that's how the difference. Okay. So if you see here, there is an IO exception thrown here, and then it goes to the caller method. Now, what is the difference between collection dot unmodifiable list and the immutable list? Now, in Java, when you want both the collection, that is unmodified and immutable, we used to create that particular list that cannot be modified. So basically, it indexed that whatever we have created from this should not be modified, but they work little bit different. Okay. And now when we are dealing with unmodifiable list, right? So it is part of the util collection, right? And it is going to wrap the list of I mean it's going to wrap the particular list of the existing list, right? And it is going to return you the unmodified version of it, right? So there will be no modification allowed if there is somebody is attempting to do that particular exception modification like adding or removing element. So you will have unsupported operation exception. So when you are trying to uh, change something as an original list, right? And you call that particular unmodified list, right? So this will throw an exception, right? So it will indicate that certain element is going added, and then it will throw an exception. But when it case of an immutable list, right, this is part of a different library, not a Java, okay, standard library. It is a part of the Google Java library. And then if you see, once it is created, it cannot be changed in any way. Okay, so it is designed in such a way that it derived it delivers the purpose, that is it should be more efficient, it should be immutable list in a I mean the implementation, right? So there will be no, I would say, reference to this particular original list, but yeah, similar or as opposed to unmodifiable list, modifying the original list will have no impact on the immutable list. Okay, so those will be completely independent and immutable, right? That's how the difference, right? Now, how does tree map maintain its order? Now, if you have heard of uh, map, which has got the implementation of hash set and other tree map, right? Now, tree map is not is going to maintain certain order, which is using internally as a red black tree data structure. So which is kind of an self-balancing binary search tree. Okay, that's how it maintain its order, right? So the key in the tree map is are ordered based on their natural sorting, right? So if they are implementing certain comparable or let's say comparator at the time of the creation, they will sort or order it in a certain with the key. Now, natural ordering, when we say, so it will depend on the comparable, right? So like you have integer or string. The tree map will use the compare to method. Okay. So to determine if they are, in the order or not with the particular. But when you are dealing with the comparator, right? When you are dealing with the comparator, if an order, it used to have a custom order which is required or needed, right? So we can pass that into this tree maps constructor to define the how the key is or should be ordered. Okay, that's how it will get its own I would say custom order, not the natural order, right? So black tree, red black tree is the, it will ensure that the key which are always kept in sorted order, and whatever operation you are performing will uh, it will have that particular same time, right? So let's say O of log n. So this is an example. Now, in this particular thing, if you see, we are putting something into the order, and then if you see, it is ordered in the natural sorting order, right? So this is how it implements the comparable interface, right, in the ascending order. Now, this is one of the favorite interview questions, and basically, it is always comes in this interview or one other interview, and this question will be definitely be there. Okay. Now hash map is basically a key value pair collection, right? So which is a map, right? But with respect to concurrent hash map, they are used or introduced as part of the concurrency package. Now, when we are talking about thread safety, right? So hash map is definitely not thread safe. So multiple threads which are trying to access or modify certain hash map concurrently, it will have an inconsistency or maybe the data correction might happen, right? So if you want thread safety, right, you can have synchronize that particular map using collection.synchronize map. But here is a catch that it will synchronize the whole map, right? So when you're trying to perform something, it will the whole lock will acquire for the whole. right? Concurrent hash map. Now, when you are dealing with threads with concurrent hash map, it is designed in such a way that multiple threads can, do some operation, and it's kind of external to the threads, right? You can perform any operations over there. Now, it uses a segmentation technique to update certain, concurrently update certain part of the map. So it is divided into multiple segments. Basically, each part will have their own independent, I would say, threads, which will be do the operation on it, right? Now, performance when you compare hash map, right? It's quite faster when it comes to single threaded, or let's say you are not performing in any, your application is not running in a concurrent scenario, right? So there will be no overhead of managing the threads and then inconsistency, right? But when it comes to concurrent, right, it is slower as compared to hash map when it is made to be thread safety, and also it is used to it will perform well because it is designed to work with the multi-threading environment, right? And it will allow multiple different updates in the different segments. Now, null values, when you compare with the hash map, it allows null key and value, but at current hash map, it will not allow null key and value because at the multiple threading environment, where the null might lead to certain exception, there may be a big problem, right? Now, locking. Now, when it comes to hash map, right, there is no locking as it is not thread safe only. But concurrent hash map, it is fine-grained locking. So I mentioned instead of locking the whole map, it is going to lock the particular segment in the bucket segment, I would say, which has got a greater benefit of having a concurrency, and it will reduce the contention basically. So this is an example of an hash map, and then you will see an example of concurrent hash map. Now, what are Java memory leaks? So, and how you can debug it. Now, you must have heard of memory leaks which are going to happen, and your application suddenly start shut down. So there is a large problem which is happening. Automatically, your application shuts down, right? So what happens is that your virtual machines will try to uh, disallocate some memory in the space, right? But it will, as there is no memory it can utilize, or there is no memory available as the resources are getting utilized quickly, it will lead to a inefficient memory utilization, and also it will lead to a out of memory, right? So your application will cause to shut down, and it will be out of memory in that case, right? Now, how it happens, right? When you have some unreachable objects, right, which are no longer needed, but still it is being referenced somewhere in the program, that is, going to prevent the garbage collection, improper resource management, not closing certain resources like file, database connection, etc., which can lead to a memory leaks. Now, there are certain static references. If you see at the overall, right, this is can uh, these are loaded at once, and then it can live for a long time. The application is there, right? So even like if it is not needed, it will be still available, right? Listeners and callback issue methods. So I mean, there are not going to remove certain event listener or a callback, which can prevent certain being the resources can be present by garbage collected, right? So this is how it happens. Now, how can you deal or debug the memory leaks, right? So there are certain profiling tools, right? One is JVisual VM, right? So this is actually itself provided by the JDK, which will monitor your memory usages. It can take an heat dump, right? And you can analyze the objects creation or retention process there, right? Now there is another tool, that is Eclipse, which is called MAT. So this is one of the powerful tool, and it can analyze up to many GBs of heap dump. So it will clearly identify where is the leak, what kind of objects are causing the excessive consumption of an memory, right? So those details and analysis it will do, and it will give you a clear graph and the picture about it. Now, heap dumps, when you let's say you want to trigger certain heap dumps, right? What it will analyze is that I mean, it will analyze the memory leaks over here. Now, this can be used using the JMap, or there are certain IDs as I mentioned, like Eclipse or IntelliJ, right? So this will show you all the objects which are there in the memory, and they are referencing where they are pointing to, and helping you to identify which is taking, or which is the I'll say the cause. Uh, Now garbage collection logs. Now garbage collection logs, I would say using we have a command like, or I would say option with the JVM, right? So we minus x log dot gc2, you can monitor certain garbage activity and then identify where the objects are being, I would say, freed up, right? So that's how we can do. Now, in order to avoid, or we can say the cover, we can have certain reviews and the best practices. So always try to review the places where there are some resources being used up, like street database connection, etc., which are not closed. So although you're doing the first level code review, but whenever it is going to be uh, merged to a certain code base or the another major branch, right? Make sure you do another code review. Now, when you're dealing with collections or map, right, you always try to clean up, which either if they are not no longer used, right? So that's how we can clean up. Now, avoid using static at the very large objects, or let's say at the collection, right? So avoid using it. It can be as minimal as it, but yeah. Now we can remove certain event listeners and the callback methods which are no longer needed, right? So that's how we can avoid. But yeah. Now, what is permgen and metaspace? Now, these are both the memory areas in the JVM which are used to store certain class metadata. But although they are differently managed and their behavior is quite different, now permgen, right? It is exactly if you see, it is called the permanent generation. Now, prior to Java 8, which is Java 7 and other, right? There used to be a stored in the class definitions, right? And then metadata, static content, including the constant pools, right? And then in turn, string pool. Now, there used to be a fixed size to it. Permanent has got a fixed size, right? If it is running out of space due to some, let's say, too many classes has been loaded or dynamically generated, it will cause out of memory, as we already discussed, right? So that's where if you see the error also, you will see the permanent gen space along with the out of memory exception error. Now, garbage collection in terms of Perlgen, these classes and the metadata are usually stored in this particular permanent generation, which were garbage collected basically, but not as an efficient or the other as they are other areas of the heap, right? So that's how. Now, Java 7 and earlier, right? There used to be you can define that minus XX and then max perm size to 250 M or whatever value you want to set, right? So you can set your perm space, right? But let's say after with the help of Java 8, right, there was a meta space. So this was replacing the permgen, which we already spoke about in Java 7, was replaced with the meta space. Now, uh, unlike that particular permgen, the meta space is no longer part of the heap. Earlier, it used to be part of the heap, right? So it is quite dynamic. It can grow automatically, sync, and then based on the available memory, right? Now, JVM does not provide any fix. Earlier, there used to be a fixed memory space, right? So, but it can expand and limit. It can also limit using the. There is a command which is using the meta space size, right? Parameter. Now, it also support meta garbage collection for classes, metadata, and then it is quite more efficient as compared to the old generation common generation space, right? So that's how it's quite different after Java 8 and how it is going to handle the memory management. Now, how does tree map differ from an hash map? Okay, so it's quite different when it comes to the usages and where they are used in context. Okay, so let's say you want to go for the ordering, right? Now you know that tree map is either a natural sorting order, you can use comparator or comparable, right? Now hash map does not maintain any order. You try to put that, it will be stored anywhere and anywhere, right? There is no, I would say, predictive things. Performance wise, when you see, when you're performing some put operation, get operation, or remove, it will have the log of log n, right? Because it uses a red black. Now, the tree map I'm talking about, and then we are talking about hash map. It is O of 1 time complexity, which is an average due to there is a hashing mechanism which is happening under it, right? Now, when you're dealing with null values, right? So tree map will not allow null key or right, but it will allow some values as a part of it, right? Because when you're trying to store some null key, it will store throw a null pointer accident. But hash map will allow both. Now, implementation wise, if you see, it implements the navigable map and it is based on the red black tree. But hash map, it only implements the map, the super map, and then it is based on the hash table basically. Now, what is out of memory? And how do we begin? Now, we have already discussed some questions which would lead to it. Now, it happens when you cannot allocate certain memory space and you run out of memory, right? So occurs due to various reasons like objects are stored too fast or your permanent generation space is not able to clear it or where the class data is stored, right? So it is not happening and it's not re-referring, deallocating the memory, right? The common issues it is heap space is exhausted, right? So due to the large object collection which is happening, database exhaustion. So when there you are storing certain class level metadata is full, or you have some excessive class loading or memory leaks which is happening. Excessive objects creation, as I mentioned, too many objects are created in a short period of time and it is not able to garbage collect properly, right? Now there are recursion or also recursive things which are calling methods which will lead to a stack, right? Excessive usage of the stack. So how to do control is that we can increase the Java allocation memory. This is how we XMX and then XMS we can use it. And we have certain heap dumps we already discussed, right? So we can enable this heap dump to analyze certain issues, memory usage, and identify what are the leaks and update creation, right? So as we already discussed, Matt is there, JVisual to analyze this, right? Now, as we already discussed, profiling tools like JVM, Visual, your kid profiler, which can be used for the memory usage and find the memory leakage. So this is why how we identify uh, the objects are not being released, like there are some certain static fields which are storing the large objects and which are not removed. So it will cause an out of memory error. Now, when it comes to Spring, right? So application.property or application.yml. Now, basically, you must have heard of it, and in the context of applications which are developed in Spring Boot, right? So these are used for certain configurations, external basically, which will allow you certain values to be set up, and then which can the Spring application can use in there when they are running, right, in the runtime. Now, what you can do is that you can configure certain server ports, database connection, logging, configuration related. So, let's say for server port you have done in the application.property, you can define, right? This is way how but in YML, it is structured in a different way, and the pattern it uses is like it is pretty structured and it is pretty visible and concise, right? So that's how if you wanted to have a more visibility or in a concise way, you can use this particular sort of application.yml. Now profiling wise, in we can use that profiles like active dev in the application.yml. But now if you want to, let's say, have some custom properties, right, you can define your own custom properties in the application.properties, right? So that's how we deal with. Now, when you're going to read certain configuration file or you want to integrate the Spring Boot, right? For the configuration file that the startup, it automatically maps this property to the applications, right? So the difference between these two are is that one is key value based file and it is quite easy to understand, and also it is quite simple in the configuration. But when it comes to YAML, there used to be a YML also earlier, but there was an when there was a restriction with the extension basically. But yeah, we can use YAML or YML basically, which will support the hierarchical structure and it is more readable and it will show you the more complex in a better way. Now, what is the purpose of @ configuration? Now, you must have heard of this in many interviews or the questions, right? If you have attended earlier, right? So this is an annotation which is used in the context of configuration class, and that you have to have certain beans definition, right? So it's kind of a special form of an @@ component, but it indicates that then it can be used in the Spring container to configure certain beans, component, or any other dependencies. Now, purpose is that we want to mark that particular bean as a bean definition, and this method within that particular class, which is annotated as annotated with the bean, right, will definitely define those particular beans, and the Spring will manage it basically, right? A certain configuration you want, which is to be centralized of the application, right, for like certain complex application. So that's where we use that instead of XML, right? We use that annotation, sorry, except encapsulation. So you can have some database setup configuration which is dedicated in that particular class, right? So this is how you define. And basically, if you see, right, as a sum up, right? So this is marked as an @ configuration, if you see, and then at the method level, you define that particular bean. Now, what is profiles or Spring Boot profiles? How do they work? Now, this is used in the context of different configuration to be maintained for a different environment, let's say dev, feature, and production. This will allow you to manage and you immediately switch between different configuration without changing the application code, right? So you want to change certain username and password or for the production, right? And you change it. You doesn't want to deploy your application again. You can just reset the configuration and it will work. Now, when you define this particular different configuration for a different environment, let's say in properties file or a YML file, we use Spring profiles, right? Properties. So that's how we use it and we define it. Now, how do we activate is that we at the runtime we can use the we can set up which is the active profile by using this command line. Let's say the hyphen Spring profile dot active or dead. In the environment variable, you can use this Spring profile active dev. In properties file, you can definitely add this profile active dev. So, I mean, if you want to have some specific configuration also, you can create it like in similar way, like for the application specific, the environment specific. So you can have application hyphen dev for the dev environment, application hyphen dot prod for the production environment, right? So you can deal with that. So that's how it indicates it can be load for a different environment. So here, if you see, this is an example of different environment, and the bean is instantiated for different production and the dev, right? So that's how it can use and access those particular properties, and it can be maintained in that particular properties. So what is actuator? How do you use it? Now, this is one of the common question with respect to Spring Boot. Uh, it is kind of an built-in tool which is provided by the Spring framework, and certain endpoints are exposed which can monitor and manage your Spring Boot application in when it is deployed in the production. So basically, it provides certain features like what is the health currently, what is the metrics, what is the application current info, some environment specific information, right, and many more. There are certain endpoints exposed. So health check, as I said, right, it will expose certain health statuses like what is the database connectivity space. Matrices, as we discussed, we have some certain performance, application performance related memory usage, how many active threads are there, environment related information like what is the current environment exposed and what are the properties available in the configuration, application level information like what is the version, description, etc. You have some events which can be triggered like audit events, right? Which can track some events in your application. You can custom endpoints are provided so that you can also create your own custom management endpoints. You can define it. So you have to add a dependency of that particular actuator. You have to enable the endpoints like by default this slash actuator health is and metrics is provided, but you can configure your own endpoints to expose in your application properties, and then you can define it, right? So Here is that particular key value pair. Now we want to access certain actuator endpoints. So if you can see here, there is a health actuator, right? You can with the local or the exact IP address of that particular with that particular port number, you can have actuator. And after that, there are health services, matrices, and info related, which will expose the data. Now, certain endpoints you want to define, right? So, custom endpoints basically. So, this is an optional. You wanted to have your own endpoints basically. This is how we have this at the rate endpoint and then certain read operations, right? And then you provide that. So, you can actually have this particular when your application is up, these endpoints will be enabled. Now, what is Spring Boot and how it differs from the Spring framework? Now, this used to be a popular question when Spring Boot was newly introduced. Spring Boot, right? And Spring has as a it has spent a lot time, and then people were a little bit with a boilerplate code. I mean, they wanted something which can reduce the development efforts and other things. And there was an introduction. So it is one of the frameworks that Spring Boot, right? It is built on top of Spring only, right? So in another way, it does nothing but ease the development of a Spring-based application. It provides certain set of default configuration. It provides certain tools to create standalone production-grade application with some certain minimal configuration. Now, the overall purpose is to reduce the complexity and the boilerplate code, which we normally used to do in a Spring application, right? So the auto configuration features, right? So it automatically configure your application whichever dependency is there in the class path. It has got their own embedded server, which is like Tomcat. You can also exclude Tomcat and include any other external servers, right? So you don't need any. I mean, these are default, so you can. It doesn't need explicitly to deploy that. Now, very minimum need is used for the XML configuration. You can use annotation extensively, right? So I would say it can handle well things, right? So minimum setup is required. Now, when you define some or create some features, right? So like health checkouts, matrices, Spring Actuator is used, right? So we just discussed some time back. Now, the configuration wise, if you see, uh, Spring frameworks will require a lot of configuration, annotation, XML, setup, right? Dependencies, etc. The implicit dependencies, right? So you have to manage it by your own. But with auto configuration, you will. It's quite easy, and it reduces your manual configuration basically. Now, web server setup we already discussed. You can have to manually externally deploy and set up that particular for a Tomcat and other, but in it is embedded in Spring Boot. Application initialization, it requires some setup and integration for the complex for the complete application, I would say. But with Spring Boot is provided at the rate in the Spring Boot application with some minimal and easy setup. So deployment wise, if you see, it is typically OR file or a jar file deployed in the external server or the container, I would say, servlet container. So Spring Boot, it can have their own self-contained executable jar or WAL file which can execute it in the embedded server. So that's how it different from Spring, right? Now, what is microservices? Now, after Spring Boot, they will try to touch base the microservices. If you have mentioned that you have worked on the microservices and cloud technologies, so make sure you are covering up the basics. What is microservices? How they different from monolith? There can be a number of questions which can be confusing, or let's say if you have not worked in, you can go wrong. Now, microservices is an architectural type, basically, where the application is kind of structured and as a collection of small and autonomous independent services, basically. And they are each focused on some certain specific business function which has got their own purpose. Now, each microservices, which is either I mean, is self-contained, it has got their own databases. They communicate with each other services using some lightweight protocols like HTTP, gRPC, right? So there are different message broker, right? We can use. So one of the important features, I would say, or the characteristic of microservices is that it's independent. So each service that can be developed, deployed, and then scaled up independently, right? So you doesn't need to worry about the whole application is inside one code base, and then you need to redeploy the whole application, right? So the work can be done independently and then deployed. Domain driven, basically, you can build your application around certain business functionality of the domain, so which will denote some purpose for that particular service to be separated and defined, and it will do their own purpose, right? Not jumbling other stuff inside its own and doing a lot of things, right? Decentralized, basically, it is going to manage its own data, and it will reduce some subtle bottlenecks which was earlier there. Uh, Communication, if you see, it is using API where we can use REST API or gRPC, right? Now, when it comes to the structure, I would say, right? So the monolith, right? So it is entire one application which is built in a single unified unit, right? So all the components, whether UI, business logic, database, data access layers, right? These are all in one integrated, and they are run in together, right? But in microservice, these are broken down into smaller independent services, and that can be developed and deployed and scaled separately. The development process, when it comes to monolith, uh, it can be in the one unit, but any changes which require has the whole entire application to be deployed. But in microservices, only that particular individual development and deployment and the scaling used to happen independently for the particular service, whichever used to be the problem, right? So it's quite faster. It's quite fast, I would say. Agile. Uh, Scalability, if you see, scalability when it comes to monolith, right? It was quite difficult because it used to scale the entire application. The whole resources used to be acquired, right? So not only one particular part. So whole resources are required, more of them, right? So, but in microservice, only that particular independent service can be scaled up and less resources will be used up, right? It was quite specific and accurate. Now, technology-wise, in Monolith, there was I would say, a single stack only. It has to be used up. There was no way where we can use a different language and different databases, basically, right? So, whole application was under one roof. Now, microservices gave opportunity where you can have a different microservices defined, use a different technology by the different team, allowing different, I mean, to use a different technology and perform some, I would say, challenging things, right? So it gives an opportunity to adapt as per the technology is moving on. So it's quite helpful. Now, complexity wise, it's generally a little bit easy and it is quite initially manageable, but let's say the system grows and it's quite big, it is quite complex, it grows, right? But when it comes to microservices, right, it is started with the development of the complex, it is I mean, well, the development, right? So it is quite manageable, and then we have to deal with the interconnect communication with the services, so that we can make use of certain saga design patterns like orchestration, deployment, orchestration, and distributed data management, right? So you can deal with that. Now, how would you design the microservice-based architecture? Now, there has been a modernization of an application. The old applications are being modernized and restructured with the latest tech stack and the right. So now designing is quite important. So which will break your application into certain small independent services so that you can handle some specific business function in a agile way, right? So and the requirements can be going to the customer or the delivery, right? So it's quite fast. So first you have to identify the business domain. So how do we go about it? We have to first identify the business domain. Now you must have heard of domain driven design, right? So it is ideally identifying certain business domains and their related functionality and convert it into the services. So each services will have its own certain bounded area, I would say, context that will handle certain specific things only or piece of the logic, right? Should not do lot many things. Now, user management will do only user management related thing. Order processing will do only order processing. Payment related will only do payment related thing, not user management related thing. So they have their own bounded context. They work in that. Whenever we want to integrate or communicate to the other service, we can communicate. while defining, right? So each services have a different specific capability, I would say, which is business related. Now, services can be autonomous with some clear responsibilities. Let's say user will manage certain related of the users, order will manage some handling of the logic related thing. Now, API related, each services will expose certain APIs which can be used for the communication, right, with the help of RESTful or gRPC. Now, when it comes to data management, now database as per services was one of the important principle when it comes to microservices. So each microservice should have at least their own database. It is not mandatory, but it is suggestible. So it will give you an loose coupling, right? So and it will eventually have a consistency where the different services may not it may not be immediately synchronized, but ultimately it will be synchronized, right? So that's how we have to deal with. Now, service communication, right? So the communication used to happen REST gRPC for the real time, the synchronous way, I would say. But when it comes to asynchronous, right, when you are not worried about the immediate response, or you are not worried about you are publishing some certain data and certain action will be taken up later, so you can use Kafka as a messaging system, or RabbitMQ, which is used for event driven, right? So this ensure that it's quite decoupled between the services and it is delivering what is required. The service discovery, this is we have to implement in order to allow certain services to be make it available or to communicate with each other at a dynamic level, so that one services is going up and down or certain instances are getting up, right? So we can use Eureka or Console for it. Now, API gateway is that this is a starting point where the incoming request comes to the and lands on the API first. So in a way, it is quite secure when it comes to communicating between the client to the server. So it will first falls on the API. It will hand it over to the appropriate service, that is microservice. So at API level, you can have certain cross-cutting concerns like security, load balancing. You can implement the rate limiting capability over there. Now, when it comes to security aspect, the authentication and authorization, you can define or you can have an centralized authentication using OAuth, right? Or you can use JWT token for secure communication between the services. Now, there are identity providers, basically like Keycloak and OAuth, right? We can make use of it so that we can make use of that as an identity provider in the authentication and authorization. So resilience and fault tolerance, basically we can implement the circuit design breaker pattern, which earlier it used to be by history. Now we have resilience 4J. Now, and we can implement certain retry mechanism to handle certain fallback or failure gracefully and ensure there is an high reliability. So timeout we can handle for certain requests so that it can control that particular cascading failures, I would say. Now, logging and monitoring, if you see, you can have some centralized ELK stack to aggregate certain logs from all the services. We can have some implementing the distributed tracing like Zipkin or some other Jaeger, right? To trace the request. We want to monitor certain performance of an area health as using the Prometheus or Grafana, or you can use Actuator as well. This is one of the popular question. How do you handle inter-service communication between the microservices? Now, there are two ways we already discussed. One is synchronous and asynchronous. So, RESTful web APIs which are defined, right? We can have some real-time communication when you are certain exposing certain APIs, right? Service A is calling service B using the REST API, that is HTTP. You get some certain data. So we have tools like Spring Web, REST, gRPC for faster in the binary communication. gRPC is for using high performance remote procedure calls. Basically, it's a framework, right? So typically, it's a protobuf, I would say. And asynchronous is basically using messaging system to communicate across the services or different using the message brokers, either RabbitMQ, Kafka, or this will decouple your services and allow them to independently process their events and message independently, right? So uh, that's how we use it. Now, event-driven architecture, when it comes to asynchronous, right? So you can publish and listen to certain events and using the event-driven system. Eventually, we have to publish certain messages to the Kafka topic or message queue, right? Where the other will communicate or consume from it, right? Now, the pattern, communication pattern, basically, if you see the request response type, right? So for the synchronization, it makes the request, it will wait for the response. But event driven, it will emit it, it will make the publish it basically. The other service will react basically whenever it wants to consume it, right? So it's quite asynchronous. So in terms of consistency, reliability, and the message broker related thing, right? So it has got different advantages, I would say. So eventually, like the consistency with the multiple services, which will avoid certain tight coupling, I would say, right? It's quite consistent. So we can implement circuit design pattern using history. So it will avoid some certain failures or unresponsiveness to the services. We can use Kafka to ensure messages delivered, and then there are certain failures or loss of the messages, right? Now, when it comes to managing the transaction and across these services, basically, right? So we use uh, distributed transaction. So basically, it's quite challenging, and when you're dealing, or it is quite when it is decentralized, basically, the nature of the service. So there are two approaches when we can how we can handle this. One is using Saga design pattern. So basically, it will when a transaction is broken, let's say into a series of local transaction, okay, you're performing some transaction. So each service will be involved in this particular transaction. It will have their own transactions and publish certain events to notify other services, and it will continue the workflow. But if certain failure happens, the system will roll back by invoking certain compensation transaction to the other services, previous services, basically. That's how it is handled. Now there are two ways the Saga design pattern it is handled. One is choreography breaks, which is services independently notify each others, and then they react to that particular service, the events, I would say. But orchestration is basically one central orchestration which will coordinate with the other services and take care of invoking it and ensuring certain steps are executed sequentially or in the correct way. So that's how, let's say, process A, B, and C, right? So services. So your C service, if it is getting failed, right? The B service and C service will trigger a compensating transaction, and it will do that. Now, two-phase commit, it is not a suggested thing, but it is a traditional way of handling the distributed transaction, which it requires involving of the coordinator and the participating services. Now, what will happen is that in phase one, it will ask the each services if it can commit the transaction, and each services will respond. It will basically prepare and respond, say if you want it is yes or no from them, and ultimately in the phase two, if all the services are saying yes, okay, so they will coordinate the, I mean, it will commit the transaction. So any services which will respond no, right? So there will be a compensating action taken, right? So it's quite challenging when you're dealing with the two-phase commit, and it is also a little bit not scalable, and also it is not resilient in terms of microservices. So you have to check out that it's a challenge. Now, best practices we have to use Saga design pattern. It is quite flexible, it's quite scalable and resilient than compared to PC. So as we already discussed, uh, let's move on. Now, what are the indexes? SQL. Now, these are the questions asked in the actual real SQL questions, right? So, index is nothing but it is going to improve your read operation, right? What are you going to do on the database table? So basically, it's kind of an index which are there is in the book, right? It is similar to that, which can locate your various information basically, or the columns basically. So now how it works is that it is structured in such a way that it is implemented using a B tree or a hash table basically. So it is structured for searching and by storing certain sorted values, right? Basically from the indexed columns. Now, instead of scanning all the rows, basically in the table, index will only allow the database to quickly narrow down some rows which needs to be fetched up, and it will in this way it will improve the performance quite significantly. Now, when you're dealing with the indexes, right, there are different types of like single column index, right, where we have only one column, composite, where we have multiple column, unique, which ensures all the indexes are unique, full text, compromisation. So basically, these are used in the context of where you want to frequently search something, filter, get some or use some join condition like primary, foreign key, using the where clause, right? So that's how we use. So along with SQL select queries, like we can, I mean, when we are using where clause, they will slow down the performance when you're trying to insert something, update something, because there are certain indexes which needs to be reshuffled or updated basically. Now, clustered index and non-clustered index. So basically, if you see uh, when the data in the table, these which are physically stored and sorted, right? So according to the cluster index, so this is how they are physically stored. Now they can have only one and one only one cluster index because the data row can only be sorted in one order, not in multiple order, right? So that's the restriction. The storage wise, in the index will definitely be stored in the table, right? There is a separate data stored in the index order, right? So typically it is usually a primary key, but yeah, performance wise, it's quite ranges from the insert to update deletion operation because certain reordering has to happen. Okay. Now, non-clustered index, if you see, so these are stored in a separate table, not in the actual data table with reference, which is pointing to certain actual rows, right? So this can have multiple non-clustered index, right? And I mean, it has got their own storage. Basically, it's a separate actual data set, I would say, a data table, and this is commonly, or I would say, the column which are frequently searched, but not involved in certain sorting or basically ordering of the data. Okay? It is used, but not in the context of that way. The performance-wise, it is specific but less efficient as for the range queries compared or to the cluster index basically. So that's how, if you see, the difference is about. Now there are different types of joins. Now you will try to ask like what are the joins, right? Can you explain certain joins? Now inner join is returns only certain rows which are both matched in the table. Okay, so when you want certain records which are I would say corresponding in the other table or both the tables basically, so you can use that. But in left join, basically it will return all the rows from the left side, matching rows from the right side, right? So there is nothing which is matched in the null values will be returned from the column from the right table basically because only matching columns from that is from the left table, right? So what you will have that is that you when you want all the records basically from the left table, regardless of whether there is a match or not, then in that case you use it, right? Now right join, it will return all things. Similar is the reverse of the right left join. So when you want certain records from the right tables, I mean all the records basically, regardless of whether it is matching in that or you find it in the left table or not, you use that. Now full join is basically it will return all the matching rows and it will in either left or right, but it will if it is nothing, I mean let's say if it is not able to find, right, the null values will be returned, right, which for the missing value side basically. So all the records from the both table and null will for the non-matching things basically. Now cross join is a Cartesian basically, meaning every row whatever it is there in the first table will combine with the other rows and it will from the second table basically. So it's a rare I would say, but can be used when you want to need certain combination of rows from the two tables, right? That's how we use it. Now, what is the difference between delete, truncate, and drop? Now, this is quite important and also important questions, I would say. Now delete is something which will you can remove certain specific table. I mean based on certain condition in the table, right? You can roll back it. There are row level operation which is happening, right, individually, right? It is quite slow compared to the truncate we'll discuss, but because it will check, right, for each row. Now, when you want certain specific rows to be deleted, you use delete. Now, truncate. Now, it will remove all the tables data from the rows from the table, but the structure will remain the same. Now it is quite faster because there is no individual row deletion happening. It is cleaning up. Now you cannot roll back. That is a difference. But in delete, you can roll back. That's a difference, right? Uh, I mean, it will not activate any trigger basically, right? It will reset any triggers basically, or if there is some certain auto increment fields which are happening as a counter, right? Which can it will straight away from some certain number to it will come to zero, right? You needed to delete all the row without affecting the table structure basically. That's when we use that. Now drop is completely removing the table from the schema itself or the from the database. Now you cannot roll back this, and also it will remove the table and it is data from the permanently. You cannot have a rollback only. So that's the table structure will be removed, indexes and the columns, certain triggers, right? You will remove all those things. Now you want to completely delete everything of that particular table and other related thing. You can use this. Okay, so these are the questions. I hope this video was helpful for the people who are preparing, and it shed some light on what kind of questions are asked. If this video was helpful, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. And please forward it to the needy people who are preparing for the interviews in your circle. Thank you.